All right, welcome everyone to the University of Arizona Law Faculty Book Talk Series. I am Teresa Miguel Stearns, Associate Dean and Director of the Daniel F. Cracchiolo Law Library. This afternoon's book talk features Associate Professor Harry Hobbs, University of Technology, Sydney, who will be sharing his new book, Micronations and the Search for Sovereignty. Our own Professor Sergio Puig will help guide our discussion after Professor Hobbs' presentation. This is an especially exciting book talk given our many collaborations, both current and future, with the University of Technology, Sydney. And I hope it's the first of many opportunities to share scholarship amongst our respective legal communities. Professor Harry Hobbs is an associate professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Technology, Sydney, and an influential constitutional and human rights lawyer working at the forefront of academic research and legal and political debate about Indigenous state treaty making. Professor Hobbs is committed to understanding how Indigenous sovereignty can be better recognized and accommodated in national and international legal systems. Drawing on both doctrinal and critical theories of constitutional, international, and human rights law, Professor Hobbs has published over 40 academic papers on subjects ranging from native title and Australia's first treaty, the Noongar settlement, to hybrid international criminal tribunals. Professor Hobbs has expertise and interest in the treaty debates in Australia. With University of New South Wales Professor George Williams, he co-authored the leading book on this topic, simply titled Treaty, in which the authors take a fresh look at modern treaty making between Indigenous peoples and governments in Australia. Professor Hobbs is also the author of Indigenous Aspirations and Structural Reform in Australia, which we have in our library, of course, and co-editor of Treaty Making 200 years and 50 years later. 250 years later. Professor Hobbs is also active in the international community of scholars and activists concerned with protecting the rights of Indigenous people. In 2020, he was elected co-chair of the American Society of International Law's Rights of Indigenous Peoples Interest Group. This group examines the rights and status of Indigenous peoples in international law, helping to bring together scholars and activists to participate in transnational information sharing and cooperation. Professor Hobbs happens to be in Tucson this week, participating in the IPLP's and Native Nation Institute's January in Tucson program. Professor Sergio Puig is our Ivo DeConcini Professor of Law and Director of the International Trade and Business Law program here at Arizona Law. He is also co-editor-in-chief of the prestigious Journal of International Economic Law. Professor Puig is the co-founder and current vice president of TradeLab.org, an organization to facilitate assistance in international trade and investment law matters by law school clinics. Professor Puig recently authored a book entitled At the Margins of Globalization, Indigenous Peoples and International Economic Law. This impactful book was one for which we hosted a book talk just a short time ago. And you can find that book talk on our YouTube channel. He is in conversation with our former professor and dean at Colorado Law, James Anaya. Let's see, Professor Puig has also authored many articles in specialized journals and book chapters, which you can access on our legal scholarship repository or on his SSRN page. So please join me now in congratulating Professor Hobbs on both his promotion and the publication to associate professor and the publication of his most recent book. And many thanks to Professor Hobbs and Professor Puig for kicking off our faculty book talk series for this spring of 2023. Thank you both so much. Just give us one moment while we shift gears here. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. All right. Thanks, everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking Sergio for inviting me to give a talk on my new book with my colleague at UNSW, George Williams. I'd also like to thank Teresa, Ricardo, and Nikki for helping to set everything up. Yeah, so thanks very much for that. And of course, everyone for attending. It's great to see so many people. It's great to be here in Tucson as well.
You probably need to speak up a bit using this class, because they won't be able to hear you otherwise.
Will do, yeah. Can people hear me online? I'll take that as maybe not, but we'll say yes. I'll speak up. So like most researchers and authors, I find my topic fascinating. I'm really interested and invested in it, right? But when I tell people a bit about what I'm doing, they find it, and probably me, bizarre. the bane of all academics, I suppose. I think they're right, though. I think it's a fair and accurate reaction. Most people find micronations odd. We don't think of them until there's a magazine piece or a TV news story about some strange man who decides he wants to fight for the local council and doesn't want to pay tax anymore and declares himself sovereign and creates his own country, right? That's all we hear about when it comes to micronations. That's odd behavior. And it's odd if you find, you spend your time researching this, right, and talking to these people. But is there something else to this story? And George and I thought maybe there is something more to this story. So in this new book, we explore the public law questions raised by micronations, raised by attempts to assert sovereignty and assert statehood, and declare your own independence. And in this talk today, I'll give you a taste of some of those questions and some of our findings. So in Australia, I begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Their ancestral land is the territory on which UTS is built. I would also pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend my respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So I'd like to do the same thing here for Tucson. Here I respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Arizona is home to 22 federally recognised tribes, and I'm sure many who are not federally recognised, with Tucson being home to the Tohono O'odham, the Yaqui, the Apache, and the Navajo. So I'd like to extend my respect to Indigenous peoples of these tribes and others more broadly. As Teresa mentioned, my main research field is on constitutional law, international law, and the rights of Indigenous peoples. And even though my sort of opening and the book suggest that this will be a light-hearted talk, I think it's important to pause for a moment. In Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples never ceded sovereignty. They continue to, and quite rightly in my view, assert a claim of and for sovereignty. Micronations also make a claim for sovereignty. Now, we understand that the relative merits of these two claims differ fundamentally, right? Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have a connection to country that stretches over 65,000 years on the territories, on the lands and waters of Australia. Over those years, they developed sophisticated political, cultural, and legal systems to regulate and manage their lives and relationships. Micronations are created when someone gets a bee in their bonnet with their local council and declares themselves sovereign. But Australian law treats assertions of sovereignty by micronations and Aboriginal people the same. There is no history of treaty making in Australia. There is no recognition of Indigenous sovereignty or Indigenous self-government. So they're treated the same for Australian law. And so it's different from the United States, obviously. So part of the motivation for this book is to sort of challenge Australian law a little bit and the Australian community and say, well, why is it that we treat them the same in law, even if they are obviously very, very different? So I try to tease out this frankly offensive legal position in the book a little bit as well. But that's the more serious part, and I know you're here for examples and funny stories, so I'll focus on that rest of the talk. Sorry, Ricardo, thanks. Perfect, yeah. So in August 1971, two members of the American-based Ocean Life Research Foundation sailed into the tranquil waters of the Minerva Reefs in the Pacific Ocean. Located around 300 miles southwest of Tonga and about 430 miles southeast of Fiji, the two submerged atolls are a long way away from any country. The Ocean Life Research Foundation hoped to change that. After mooring their 54-foot pleasure yacht within the lagoon that separates the north and the south reefs, the two men set about their plans. They dredged up several mounds of sand, soil, and coral to above the high water mark. They then encased those mounds of sand with concrete, reinforced concrete, and began to develop some rudimentary construction. On top of that, they placed a 26-foot flag, a blue and gold flag with a torch in the middle. And Minerva, land of the rising atoll, was born. The chief architect behind the Republic of Minerva was Michael Oliver, coin dealer, gold speculator, and real estate mogul in Nevada. And he minted a lot of coins, as you can see, with the goddess Minerva. And it's got the latitude and longitude of the new state as well. So Michael Oliver is an interesting man. He was worried that the US was becoming a fascist socialist state, and he began to develop ideas for how an ideal society could be organized. Inspired by the economist Ludwig van Mises, author Ayn Rand, and philosopher Andrew Galambos, Oliver drafted a political manifesto for his laissez-faire paradise. For several years, he travelled or sent representatives all over the world in search of a suitable location where he could realise his vision and escape from high taxes, riots, drugs, and crime. And eventually, he settled on the Minerva Reefs. Progress proved hard going, though. Only 15 acres of land had been reclaimed by the time his funds were exhausted. Nearby countries were also watching with some alarm. In June 1972, just 6 months after he issued his Declaration of Independence, the Tongan Navy arrived. They ejected him and they dismantled his construction, and the Republic sunk beneath the waves. So the Republic of Minerva might be bizarre, but it's far from unique. Eccentric and enterprising people all around the world have created their own countries for a range of reasons. You might be aware of some of them. On the left here is perhaps the most famous, the one that is on the cover of the book, the Principality of Sealand. It's located on an abandoned World War II anti-aircraft platform off the coast of the UK. It was founded in a dispute over radio broadcasting licenses. The Principality has even become the subject of a key case in the international law syllabus about what is a state. Another prominent micronation is the Principality of Hutt River. This one's from Australia. Here's some currency. Established in a dispute over the regulation of wheat harvests, the Principality became an inspiration for thousands of people in Australia and across the globe. As we know, people all over the world want their own country, but there's something very different between Puerto Rico and Hutt River, between Scotland and Minerva, between Catalonia and Sealand. These strange entities are micronations. So in my book with George Williams from the UNSW, we explore around 100 of these entities, and we ask a series of questions. What are micronations? Where are they located? How many are there? Why do people set them up? And how do they do it? And perhaps most significantly, how do recognised states respond? In my time today, I'm just going to focus on a few of these questions, but I'm happy to answer more questions afterwards if you have time as well. But here we've got a Republic of Rathnelly, which is located in Toronto. It was founded over in a dispute with the construction of a speedway. So what are micronations? Here is Jeremiah Heaton, who has proclaimed the formation of the Kingdom of North Sudan in the disputed Bitwal Desert between Sudan and Egypt. So the simplest way to define what it means to be a micronation is by considering what it's not. Micronations look a bit like states. You know, they want to be a state. They mint coins, they issue passports, they print stamps, but they're not states. This is because they lack status under international law. And their defining feature is, in fact, they lack the same qualities as proper nations, even though they mimic them. It might be hard to believe, but despite their ubiquitousness, there's no universally accepted definition of what it means to be a state in international law. In fact, international lawyers have basically agreed it's too hard to reach a definition. Of course, the difficulty in developing a clear definition has not prevented lawyers from trying. And that's what we do, right? And the most common definition is the Montevideo Convention, 1934. The convention outlines 4 criteria of a state: defined territory, a permanent population, a government, and a capacity to enter into relations with other states. The list seems clear on its face, but as we know, there are complications. First, the criteria are flexible. There's no rule prescribing a minimum area of territory, size of population, or effectiveness of government. So as we know, Monaco is recognised as a state, despite being only just over 2 square kilometres in size. Tuvalu and Nauru are both recognised as countries, even though they have less than 11,000 people that live there. Somalia had no central government for about 15 years, but this did not threaten its status as a state. There's also an inherently political aspect to statehood. Some entities that easily satisfy the convention requirements are not considered to be states. Taiwan is not a state, as an example. And there are also other requirements of statehood that aren't included in this list. Most significantly, a state cannot have been established in breach of international law. For this reason, Rhodesia was never a state. Could we say that Minerva was a state then, even if it only lasted for 6 months? It had a territory, it had a population, 2 or 3 people, right? It had a government, and it spent a lot of time trying to enter negotiations with Tonga, Fiji, and the United States. It seems to meet the definition, right? But as we know, Minerva was not a state, right? And indeed, all micronations are not states. The key to statehood, as an Australian, James Crawford, has explained, is governing power with respect to territory. To be a state, an entity must possess a government or system of government in general control of its territory, to the exclusion of other entities not claiming through or under it. So this reflects the distinction between owning your flat and making laws, right? You can own your flat, own real property, but you can't make laws for that territory. Only the state can do that. The point is that to be a state, you must be independent or sovereign, right? When you have that means you have you're not under the legal authority of another state. And it's here really where most micronations fail. You might declare yourself independent, but you don't have the legal authority to do that. You lack any legitimate foundation, really. So this highlights what it means to be a micronation. Micronations are self-declared nations that perform and mimic acts of sovereignty and adopt many of the protocols of nations, but they lack a foundation in domestic and international law for their existence and are not recognized as nations in domestic or international forums. They look a bit like states, but they're not going to be a state. They won't be recognized as a state. So this leads to the natural question: why do you do it, right? What's in it for you? Why would you want to create a state? Here's a photo of in the Australian papers of the royal family in the Principality of Hutt River. So micronations have no legal basis for their existence. Why do you do that? Why do you bother? It must take a lot of time to do it, to be a state, right? Responding to correspondence, negotiating treaties. Some of the people I've spoken to about this say they spend up to 20 hours a week playing the state. Why do you do that? So people do it for many reasons. Some do it for ideological reasons, to build their own utopia. As the Republic of Minerva suggests, libertarians are especially prominent. Right? So a lot of libertarians might want to break free from the shackles of the state and create something new. Even if a utopia is not desired, lots of micronations are founded in a combination of frustration with regulation and a burning sense of political injustice. I often think that for these people, it's not so much a utopia as you're searching, but you're a vexatious litigant, essentially trying to break free from the court, and you can't get over a particular decision of the council or the court, right? So many are formed in battles against councils. And I've got a crest here of the independent state of Rainbow Creek from Australia, which emerged as part of a decades-long compensation dispute between state farmers in Victoria and the government's State Rivers and Water Supply Commission over the building of a bridge. Other micronations owe their formation to their creators' sense of personal expression and desire for attention. This is also very prominent. Here is the Republic of Molossia, President Kevin Borg. He's located just over the border in Nevada, and he runs his micronation as Banana Republic. As he says, it's an expression of personal sovereignty, creativity, imagination, and political satire. It's a nice way of looking around the world, see what other countries are doing, and say, I can do that. Some micronations are founded for a laugh, and others because of boredom. So on the left here, we've got the Yellow Fleet. It's a micronation created by the crews of 15 ships stranded in the Suez Canal during the Six-Day War in 1967. The war only lasted less than a week, but the canal was blocked for 8 years. And so the crew had to do something to pass the time. And so they created a little community, and they made stamps, and they posted those stamps. And they often got through regulation, often got through the borders, right? And they created their own nation. Maybe you think you can do a better job of running a country. In 2005, a sculptor from New York, Zach Landsberg, bought a 2-acre property in Utah and decided to establish a state. As he explains, his decision was sparked by frustration with the American government's mismanagement of and response to the Iraq War and Hurricane Katrina. Landsberg thought, I can run a country better than these clowns. Where a town or small community supports the idea, micronationalism can also promote tourism and deliver an economic boost to a region. The Republic of Whangamamoma on the North Island of New Zealand emerged when regional council boundaries were changed. Right? So upset about the potential of having to play rugby union for their rivals in the town over, they decided they should create their own state. Initially a symbolic act aimed at drawing political media attention to their concerns through humour, the motivation has shifted over time. Republic Day is now celebrated every 2nd January, attracting thousands of tourists. So it's a good way to make a bit of money as well, right? Micronations are also formed to protest government policy or legislation. In 2004, Dale Anderson, an Australian, sailed to an uninhabited island east of the Great Barrier Reef. He planted a flag and announced the formation of the Gay and Lesbian Kingdom of the Coral Sea. He did so to protest the passage of Australian legislation that banned same-sex marriage. And he thought, if I create a state, I can draw attention to this and help put political pressure on the government to change the law. In 2017, the kingdom was dissolved following the legalisation of same-sex marriage. No longer exists. So it succeeded, you can say, right? Creating a country is a great way to draw attention to your cause. So environmentalists have recognised this. In the 1990s, 3 Greenpeace activists landed on a tiny, isolated granite rock in the North Atlantic and claimed the formation of the global state of Waveland. They did so to prevent nearby countries from overfishing the waters and to stop oil exploration. Here are stamps from the independent state of Aramoana in New Zealand, which were established to stop an aluminium smelter being developed. You can also create a micronation as a vehicle to critique the concept of statehood. The kingdom of Elgaland and Bargland was created by two Swedish artists, and it asserts sovereignty between borders. And it also asserts authority over other intervals, such as the transition from being asleep to wakefulness. That's the way what it does. There can also be a dark side, though. Micronations may be created to scam unsuspecting people. And the most audacious fraud in history centered around the fictional Central American nation of Poye. And here's a lithograph from the book that was used to encourage investors in Scotland and England to invest in this nation that didn't exist. So these are just a few of the very many reasons you might have to create a micronation. So how do you do it, right? Now we know what to do. What do we do? So micronations challenge existing conceptions of statehood and sovereignty, statehood and international legal personality. But they do so largely by engaging in the rituals of statehood. You know, these people aren't revolutionaries or rebels. They really believe in the law. They act through the law in order to create their own country. So they may be unqualified or unskilled in law, but they act through their own understanding of what the law is. And they're typical then they're careful then to declare their independence in a way that they consider, or at least argue, to be a lawful basis for their justification. Meticulous in their planning and apparent justification, micronations send letters to government officials, foreign states, and even the UN, informing them of their plans. Basically saying, you know, I have a right to do this because you have failed in your obligations in X, Y, and Z. So they draw on lots of legal claims. The Magna Carta is very prominent as well, right? So perhaps conscious of the fragility of their legal claim, they might strive to ground their independence and statehood on centuries-old legal instruments. In seeking to cloak their actions in celebrated documents and enduring legal principles, they might hope that their unsound or shaky legal status could be remedied. These efforts are also manipulative attempts to rely on legal ignorance. Ordinary citizens might not know anything about the Magna Carta, but they may have heard of it. And so if they're told that this person has the right to do so because of the Magna Carta, they might just go along with it. So they sort of go both ways. And I've got a couple of statements here. Hutt River was founded because of the Magna Carta. He said that he had a right to create his own country because of a dispute over a wheat harvest because of the Magna Carta. Alas, you know, one of the first cases in the High Court of Australia said the Magna Carta does no such thing. You can't use it for any particular purpose. The Prime Minister of Australia at the time wrote to him and said, please stop doing this. There is no legal basis for this. The Magna Carta does not work. Other famous ones are the Antarctic Treaty is also very prominent as well. And I've got a good story here from another American. So the coldest, driest and windiest continent, Antarctica may appear to be a strange territory to desire. But its hostile environment, a lack of easily accessible resources and isolation are alluring to the right person. As you know, the Antarctic Treaty freezes sovereign claims. It also left large portions of the continent unclaimed. This includes the 1.6 million square kilometre Marie Byrd land, which remains the largest unclaimed territory on Earth. Unclaimed by recognised states, that is. Many micronations claim sovereignty over Marie Byrd land and other parts of Antarctica based on a supposed loophole in the treaty. And I'm sorry if your work is in the law of the sea or the Antarctic Treaty. I'm about to expose many loopholes in these legal instruments, right? So Grand Duke Travis McHenry was the first person who discovered this loophole, right? So he's a Nevadan, again, must be something about Nevada. What he discovered was that it may prevent states from claiming sovereignty. It doesn't prevent individuals from claiming sovereignty. Okay? So he found this out, discovered this. He claimed sovereignty over Marie Byrd land and then formed a state to govern the territory. Yeah. So in November 2001, he wrote letters to each of the 12 original signatories of the Antarctic Treaty, announcing his formal claim and the creation of a new country, and looking to engage in diplomatic rituals. He did not receive a reply from any of them. Only one state seemed to notice, actually, his employer, the US Navy. They wondered why he was contacting foreign governments and asked him to stop it. But nonetheless, I think he left the service and he's still leading his country here, as you can see. These are the claims that he makes as well, right? Yeah. Many micronations rely on the law of the sea as well. And so American libertarians have been particularly interested in the possibility of creating states on artificial islands or reclaimed land on coral seas. You have the Sea Study Institute, obviously, is a prominent one now. But you remember Michael Oliver and the Republic of Minerva. There was Lazarus Long and the Principle of New Utopia is trying to be built on the Caribbean Sea. The Securities and Exchange Commission put a stop to that. Two more micronations, Abylonia and Teluga, failed off the coast of San Diego in the 1960s. That same decade, two competing groups also endeavored to establish states 16 kilometers off the coast of Florida. And Ernest Hemingway's brother, Lester, tried to set up a country on a raft 10 kilometers off the coast of Jamaica. So it seems pretty prominent, right? A lot of people doing this. Perhaps I'm being unkind, though. It's not only Americans who are interested in creating new states on the high seas. The Republic of Rhode Island, I'm not sure people have heard about this. There's a Netflix movie about the Republic. This is located 300 meters off the coast of Italy. The harbour master in Rimini wasn't happy with the creation of this new country, and they exploded it. It was very effective. So these attempts all occurred in the 1960s and 70s. This is not a coincidence, but this period represents a gap between the signing of the 4 international treaties on the law of the sea that encouraged exploitation of ocean resources and developments in jurisprudence and state practice that clarified the scope of coastal authorities' jurisdiction. So during this period, it was unclear whether states had authority over waters several miles off their coastline. Perhaps new states could be built on reefs off the coast. You know, it's harder now with the law of the sea. You've got to look some 200 nautical miles from the coast. And that's really why I guess the Republic of Minerva was so far away. So you need to point to some legitimate basis for statehood, but you also need to mimic states. You need to act like a state, right? It's like you fake it until you make it. And this is what micronations do as well. So you can see they create national symbols to both imitate and critique statehood. They draft their own constitutions, they compose their own national anthems, and they design their own flags. They also confer their founders with royal titles, issue stamps, and mint currency. Paraphernalia of nationhood serves as visual representations of statehood that can confer a degree of legitimacy on these people. So postage stamps and coins are very popular. So are passports, but these can cause complications. So this is the Contra Public. I'm not sure if people are aware of this. It's off the Key West, Florida. It's where it's located. They never actively sought sovereignty, really, I guess, but they played along. They enjoyed pretending to be a state. They often issued lots of passports. Apparently, 10,000 of these passports were sold from about the 1980s to the 1990s. You get the regular blue passport for about $100, or a diplomatic passport that's red for $1,200. So it's a good money earner, right? But there's as I said, there's a dark side, right? So although of no legal value, the passports looked realistic, particularly in the 80s and 90s, before all the technology that was put through in the passports. And perhaps enough to fool immigration authorities. So the leader of the Contra Public, Peter Anderson, claimed that he had entered the US on a Contra Public passport many times and never had a problem. But the steady stream of income was affected by the September 11 attacks. So in 2001, the FBI announced that Mohammed Atta, one of the hijackers, had been granted a Contra Public passport. So it wasn't clear necessarily whether he entered the US on that passport, but he had a Contra Public passport in his possession. And so since then, they haven't sold any more passports, essentially. If they do, they write parody on it at the front. So these things can be challenging, right? When they look like a state, and if you haven't heard of them, you assume they must exist. Because why would someone go to the trouble of making up a passport for a country that doesn't exist? There are also other challenges, right? You might want to get citizens to join your country. You might lean on your family and friends, but also you might not want to because they might think you're a bit weird. So you might open a citizenship portal online and attract people to join in, pay you $10, become a citizen. So the Principality of Sealand received 2,000 applications after the election of Donald Trump, and they received another 2,000 actually after Brexit. So there are a lot of people, a steady stream of people saying, I don't really like what's going on here. I'm going to join this other country. But this can confuse ordinary people unaware of the legal status or the reality of the micronation. And so this circumstance, the dance that micronations play between authenticity and illegitimacy can collapse and provoke real tensions. So the gay and lesbian kingdom of the Coral Sea Islands received hundreds of applications from queer people in Iran wanting to become a citizen, wanting to come to the territory. And it was really difficult, obviously, for proponents. The micronation had to explain that it wasn't real. And people would say, well, why have you played this joke on me? And they had to explain that, well, we didn't think it was a joke. I'm sorry. This is just really challenging. And scam artists can get involved as well. The Republic of Liberland, which is a micronation that apparently exists on the Danube River between Croatia and Serbia, on a portion of territory that neither state claims because of a dispute over the border. The leader flew to Turkey in order to sell citizenship to Syrian refugees at $1,000 a pop. So there are real challenges with this. In my final moment, final little part of this talk, I'll look at how states respond. Because obviously at some point you think, if scam artists have been involved, states need to respond. But also if there's just that challenge of illegitimacy and authenticity, states need to respond as well. So they don't have any legal basis, right? But they exist in the real world. And that forces states to react sometimes. And there are several ways that this happens. So a state may perceive a micronation as a competitor or threat and send in the army or police to shut it down. So we've seen the Italian authorities blew up the Republic of Rhode Island. Croatian and Serbian authorities have also been pretty clear that the Republic of Liberland does not exist and you cannot visit it if you try. So they're trying to shut it down as well. Violent responses do occur, but micronations are more commonly seen as benign or of no, not really harmful, right? So in most cases, authorities allow them to act, to call themselves a king, and as long as they get on with it, and they follow the road rules and continue to pay tax, right? So the Principality of Hutt River in Australia understood this implicit bargain and survived for over 50 years. He never paid tax, but he paid a lot of foreign aid, which just happened to connect to exactly what the tax authorities thought he owed. After about 15 years of this, he decided I didn't want to do that anymore, right? And so that's what brought him down. He stopped paying tax. And in 2017, the West Australian Supreme Court declared that anyone can declare themselves a sovereign in their own home, but they cannot ignore the laws of Australia or not pay tax. And that they were forced to sell the farm to pay their tax bill, unfortunately. But you'll be pleased to know they maintain a government in exile. They didn't want to interview for the book, actually, because as they told me, they couldn't see where they fit in with the project, because they're not a micronation, they're a real country, but there's something trouble with the recognition. The Principality of Snake Hill, which is located in New South Wales, has also largely been left alone. Princess Paula explained how the Australian government reacted to their Declaration of Independence. We did fully expect the response that most people do get around the world when they try to secede. They usually get a letter or some visit from government employees who try to mediate the situation. Mum even got worried and said, they'll send tanks. I said, relax, this is Australia. No one reads anything. And it's true. They just sent a letter saying, thanks very much for that. And they did order sits. It gets stranger. This man here, John, His Grace, the most noble, the Duke of Avram. He was located in Tasmania in Australia and selling coins for his Duchy of Avram. He got arrested because you can't sell coins, obviously. Only Australia can make coinage. The magistrate was going to let him off and say, look, I understand these are just tokens. This is just a fun thing you do. That's fine. You can go away. And he was adamant. He said, no, these are coins for my duchy. It was sort of a back and forth. Eventually, the magistrate sort of said, well, I'm going to let you go anyway, but please stop doing it. He was so incensed that he stood Parliament and won election in the Tasmanian Parliament. And so this is his official portrait from the Tasmanian Parliament, actually. That's his official name that he changed by deed poll. So you look in the hand side in Tasmania, and this is his name. So states might also play along and pretend to entertain their existence. The day after the Contrapublic seceded from the US, the Florida Governor Bob Graham visited. He was invited to speak at the Florida Keys Community College. And Graham said that President Ronald Reagan was actually pleased with the Declaration of Independence and sovereignty of the Contrapublic. As he explained, Cuba is no longer 90 miles from our shores. It's now 150 miles. It's rare, but sometimes micronations might actually find a piece of territory unclaimed by any state. And this is indeed what happened with the Republic of Minerva, right? There's two submerged atolls, so you can't actually live there. After the Tongan Navy kicked Michael Oliver off, they claimed the atolls for themselves. Fiji weren't very happy. And so even today, there's a dispute in the International Seabed Authority between Tonga and Fiji over who actually has authority to these atolls. The most often, though, is provoking of diplomatic incidents. Micronations like to engage with the state. What they want is recognition. The best way to get recognition is to make yourself a nuisance. You can send letters to the state, that's fine. They might reply, they might not reply. But if you force them to respond, that's perfect, right? That's what you want. So founded in 1967, it took a little while for Sealand to gain international attention. In the 1970s, they decided to make money by selling passports and stamps. A group of them were arrested in Luxembourg for selling fake currency. That was okay, it was good, but they didn't get enough attention, right? They eventually filed a motion in the International Court of Justice to try and get out of the claim. They tried to, a German became a citizen of Sealand and then went to the petition to the Cologne court to remove his German citizenship because he was a citizen of Sealand and you couldn't have dual citizenship. That didn't work again, unfortunately. So they're getting worried about what could they do? So what happened was one of the Germans, Alexander Achenbach, invited Prince Roy to Austria so he could buy Sealand. So Prince Roy flew to Austria, left his son on the port, and met Achenbach. Unfortunately, the bid was a ruse. While Roy and Joan were in Austria, a group of Germans landed on Sealand and took control. And they were eventually ejected by a determined Roy who took them hostage. And here's a photo of the hostage of the people, the Sealanders who have taken Gernot Putz, a German hostage. You can see the hostage in the background there. And they refused to negotiate. The Germans went to the British and said, "What on earth is going on? Can you please stop this piracy that's going on in your name?" The British said, "Look, we don't really want to engage with him because every time we fight with him, he wins, essentially, right? He's more determined, more tenacious, and we don't really care about this." So the Germans sent an official representative to Sealand to negotiate the release of the hostage. Dr. Christopher Niemöller was unable to secure his release, but he was baffled by the situation and wondered whether the entire event was an elaborate publicity stunt. And if so, it seemed to work, right? Sealand hosted an official diplomatic representative from another country on their territory who negotiated with them as they would appear. With that success achieved, Bates finally released his hostages a few days later. But unfortunately, this meeting did not mean Germany recognised Sealand as a nation. And in the book, to finish now, in the book, I mean, it's a good question, right? We finish with a number of themes, or explore a number of themes. One of them, and I'll just mention this today, is that everyone I've mentioned is a guy. Okay? You might be surprised to know that men are heavily overrepresented in the number of people who decide to declare their own sovereignty. You look surprised, right? Yeah. So surprised. So surprised. They're almost universally male. So too are the masculine accoutrements that often accompany micronational assertions, right? Brash military medals, faux royal titles, dictatorships, as well as bombastic declarations of sovereignty and independence. But not all are so patriarchal or so geared at domination and control. And I'll finish with my favorite micronation, which is led by an American artist, Carolyn Yagdjian. It's the Ambulatory Free States of Obsidia. So founded on International Women's Day in 2015, Obsidia describes itself as the world's only feminist micronation. Located at the confluence of feminism and geography, the Ambulatory Free States of Obsidia is actually a tiny matriarchal micronation, which consists of a chunk of obsidian rock that is being liberated from the house of a former lover. The micronation has an open border. However, due to the size limitations and fragility, humans cannot physically enter the landmass. As Yagdjian explains, I've always been attracted to the idea of statehood, and this is an opportunity to question a lot of things people accept as normal about national identity. The unusual nature of the micronation serves the purpose of attracting attention to Yagdjian's political ideals. Obsidia works with Women on Waves, a Dutch organisation that provides sex education, contraceptives, and safe abortion practices in international waters off the coast of states where abortion is illegal. So as she says, borders are the enemy of mutual aid, of autonomy, of feminism, and indeed freedom. Obsidia wants an international sisterhood where the only boundaries for women are the ones they mandate over their own bodies. And it's through the weird and wonderful world of micronations, I think, that Grand Marshal Carolyn Yagdjian of the Ambulatory Free States of Obsidia can realise her vision for a better future. And I think this is probably a more optimistic way of why you might want to create your own micronation. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Harry. This is really a wonderful topic and a great book, and a wonderful exploration of what it seems to be, in first instance, a very light topic, right? But underneath, it really uncovers these deep complications on fundamental aspects of international law, right? The formation of states, claims of self-determination, nationality, diplomatic protection, and the political aspects of recognition of states, obviously. So one may confuse, your topic as just, a footnote in a series of, interesting but irrelevant topics. But in reality, it is quite relevant. So let's just start with a little bit more of the relevance. So what do you think is the main lesson of your book, that legitimate claims of self-determination, and you can put whatever name is there, right? I mean, maybe the Catalonian movement, maybe others, right? I mean, it's even complicated to put. But what is the main lesson if they want to succeed in the creation of a nation? Because what you seem to be exploring here is those nations who never succeeded.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
So if we can, get into a little bit of the complications of this.
So as you know, you can tell from here, these nations won't ever succeed, right? And some of them aren't interested in succeeding. They're interested in doing it for their own political or social or economic reasons. But there are some that sort of seriously do desire a statehood. And I think still will find it challenging to get accepted, right? But for the more legitimate attempts, really, and in the book we have this sort of spectrum of state-like entities where we go from microstates, some things like Monaco or Luxembourg, and all the way to sovereign citizens, essentially, who kind of also make a claim for sovereignty, but don't necessarily make a claim for community and statehood. We sort of try and tease out different sort of legal points and political points between each of these communities and each of these different entities. And I think the main thing is that it's really important to start off with a legal basis. Right? And so you obviously need to do the proper things and look for a legal basis for why you can secede. What is the basis for your claim? But ultimately, it just comes down to politics. And your state, even though it's not a legal point in the convention, recognition is not important. If someone doesn't recognize you as a state, that doesn't mean you're not a state. Lots of states don't recognize each other for political purposes or political reasons. But ultimately, if you want to get in the club of states, you need to be accepted into the club of states. And so Colonia obviously wasn't accepted when they made their Declaration of Independence, right? The European Union and other countries decided, well, we don't want to get Spain offside, so we won't accept this declaration. But Kosovo has been accepted in many respects. And so ultimately it is important to get allies. And so the number one thing I think you need to do is get a broader international support. South Sudan is a state because it was had the support of the United States. And it had the support of the United States primarily, I think, because Sudan had been harboring Osama bin Laden for many, many years, right? And so there was a reason for the United States to say, well, yes, it's important for us to recognize South Sudan as a separate country and a new country. And I think that's ultimately the most important thing. You need friends.
Yeah, well, that's a very important point, and I think you're right. I think the Kosovo provides a really good example, right? That also the political aspect of this requires an association of states willing to support that claim, push it through international organizations and to the UN, the World Bank, and what have you, to eventually become a much more robust claim.
And de facto states that sort of have, or proto states that maybe have some sort of, like in Ukraine, right? These states, Luhansk doesn't have the support from other countries to be its own state because it's clearly a puppet state that's ruled by Russia. So this sort of one is one example where they might make a claim for statehood, but it's not accepted. And so it won't be accepted in the current climate.
Yeah. So let's just go now to the other side of this, which is also very interesting. Of course, your background is in indigenous rights, and maybe that was the initial, perhaps, trigger of your exploration, right? The questions, how to differentiate legitimate questions of self-determination and how to operate within that framework versus what it seems in many instances, self-serving claims of sovereignty, right? So for the indigenous rights community, which is prominent among faculty here and students in Arizona, so what do you think is the main message that you want to transmit in your analysis? And how best to provide tools for, folks who are probably defending the rightful ideas of tribes and nations who seem not to belong to a nation?
Yeah, and it's a really important question, and something I found challenging with this book, where I'm trying to look at sort of more esoteric or eccentric claims, right? But indigenous claims are very, very real, very legitimate, but they're also not recognised as states, particularly not even in Australia. Not recognised sovereignty and self-determination isn't recognised. And I guess the conclusion of the book, and we look at indigenous nations in the book as well, the conclusion is that indigenous nations, particularly in the United States, have an inherent right to sovereignty. They have inherent right to self-determination, which they exercise. It's constrained by US law. In America, obviously, it's constrained, but they have that inherent right. And one thing to think about is a claim for statehood desired or desirable, right? Do you need to be a state, or do you just want to possess a larger expanse of self-determining powers? What's the authority that you want to exercise? And each indigenous nation will have their own answer to that question. Some indigenous nations will say, we want to be a state. Others will say, well, we want to possess the full range of self-determination powers that may be up to, but not including statehood, sovereign statehood. And so part of it, it's more geared, obviously, an Australian audience by saying that we should recognise indigenous people's inherent sovereignty. We should sort of rise up a little bit closer to where the US is and accepting tribal courts, accepting a tribal jurisdiction. But the US also should probably change its laws around these areas as well to expand or allow or to withdraw and allow indigenous communities, indigenous nations to exercise a fuller degree of self-determination. And again, that comes down to politics, really. Yeah. But I think that's challenged because it was challenging just because I try to keep the discussion separate because the claims are very different. The claims are backed by long histories, tens of thousands of years, 65,000 years in Australia of operating as a distinct political community with a unique political, legal culture and system that is not recognised by settler states.
Absolutely, but I think there is also a tendency of people who do not understand well these claims to confuse them, right?
So I initially was interested in writing this book because in my work on Indigenous sovereignty, people will often say, "Oh, is that like the Hutt River in Australia?" Right. Yeah, and hopefully people would not make that same claim in the United States, but in Australia, where there isn't that language and that recognition, that history of treating Indigenous nations as sovereign entities, sometimes people get confused by it. And if you're talking to a journalist who says, "Oh, someone declared themselves sovereign," is this just like this Indigenous nation that did the same thing last week? I was trying to patiently explain, well, no, it's very different. And so part of the motivation of the book was to focus on that, I guess.
Yeah, it is really strong, and I see that in being part of the Mexican Indigenous Reform discussions, right? How much there was a pushback by the some aspect of society, Mexican society. It's like, well, this is giving special rights, or and then they get to this. It's like, well, what's next? It's like the independence, and then the response of the indigenous community is like, no one is talking about that, right? We just need recognition, and we live in a plural state that's different, and that is a very important point. So let me just open the discussion a little bit, and maybe then come back to other questions that may be very relevant, of course, in the context of the referendum of Puerto Rico, maybe the China, Philippines arbitration over the South Sea and others. But I would like to see, what's up. I can see people. So let's start.
I think you probably need to spend. I'm sorry.
To maybe follow up on what you were just discussing about how indigeneity relates to some of these microstates, because I think it's often something that gets conflated, indigenous self-determination with this microstate movement, and they get compared frequently. But as you were talking, it seemed to me that the microstates are much more akin to colonization and the colonization efforts from earlier in history, and that they have a lot more similarity to those types of efforts and initiatives, which many of which were successful ultimately. And as you were talking also, it struck me that, it's not just a bunch of crazy men, it's a bunch of crazy white men that we're seeing, at least in your presentation. So I was wondering how similar those movements are and how we conceptualize maybe some of those efforts in relationship to statehood and self-determination to understand what these efforts really reflect as far as individuals' consent to govern, consent to legal standards, laws, rules, and norms, and how maybe we reconceptualize those in ways that are more helpful in separating them maybe from false equivocations to indigenous peoples and things in that area.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And you're right, it is generally a bunch of silly white men. It's people who are in sort of middle class or upper middle class, really, who have the time and the energy and the money to make a state, to claim to be a state, right? And it involves making a claim for territorial sovereignty over some land that they have no connection to necessarily, right? Or that they bought a house and they can maintain, they try to claim that. So it is I think it is very similar to that settler colonial ideal. And micronations certainly are found all over the world, but I found them most prominent in settler colonial states. And one of the good things, I guess, with this research is that they're all they like attention. And so I've sort of, I'm clear that I'm looking for this and researching this, and they come to me and they say, have you heard about mine? Have you heard about mine? Have you heard about mine? So I do think that I've got a kind of a pretty good view of all of them, or not all, but many that exist. And certainly that while there are some overseas that, in non-settler colonial contexts and in non-English contexts, the vast majority I've found, I'd say 85% have been found in settler colonial states. And I think that psyche is really important. Because it's something that as a white person in a settler colonial state, you probably grow up with. That sort of claiming sovereignty, claiming territory is a natural right. You manifest destiny in the US, right? And so I think it's no surprise that a lot of them are found in these countries. In terms of sort of drawing out the false equivalency, I think it is just a recognition that not all of them actually want to be a state. They just like playing it. There's like a live action role play for some people, right? There are conferences where people get together where they sign treaties and they have a fun time, and that's totally reasonable and totally okay, right? You can do whatever you like to do in your own community or friends and family, right? But I think there's that nature of it is a big journey. So I agree with you, and I don't really know necessarily how to make that policy difference, except by sort of retention spotlight what people are doing. So this is very different from governing and making, and doing the hard work of trying to be a larger community beyond just an extended person and their family, right? It's very different being a state versus claiming territory.
We have some of the folks leaving right now because we start classes at 1:30. So don't, it's nothing that you said or.
No, it's something you said, but why don't I close the formal portion, but anyone who would like to stay and continue to engage with Professor Hobbs, please do. He agreed before that he's got some time, so I'm gonna just stop the recording, but let's give him a round of applause first. And we've even got a couple of questions in the chat there.
Yeah, let's go over those. Are we close now?